So a subscriber has asked me to cover the question of where does the bailout money come from? The overly simple answer is we just create it with a calculator, add a decimal point or two, and add it to the national debt. Now, I'm certainly not an economist, and I find economics quite confusing, so this episode was a challenge for me. But I learned a few things that I want to share and talk about. So first, some history. Here in the United States, it's been proven that we love war. Our country was founded on one, after all. So it may be easier to understand this in terms of going to war. Now, when the United States was born, it was born in debt, about $70 million of debt. We owed money to France, Dutch bankers, and domestic creditors who had lent it to us to get rid of those pesky British people. So how do we pay that debt back? Well, ironically, with taxes and tariffs. This was very unpopular and led to the infamous Whiskey Tax Rebellion, which the government suppressed. But the taxes, tariffs, and a growing economy did help pay back the debt to only $34,000 in 1835. The next major borrowing spree the United States undertook was to pay for the Civil War. But this time they did it by issuing and selling about $2.3 billion in bonds, basically a government IOU, and by physically printing 450 million greenbacks of new paper money. We also see the first income tax come into play. The debt reached about $2.7 billion in 1866. Then came World War I, raising the debt to $25 billion. The social programs used to alleviate the pain of the Great Depression took the reducing debt back up to $37 billion. And by the end of World War II in 1945, it was nearly $260 billion, or 122% of GDP. So 22% more than the perceived value of our economy. The debt stayed relatively constant until the Vietnam War, which saw it rise to $350 billion. Then in the 70s, we start to see the exponential debt curve really taking off. And in the 80s, we see borrowing increase for both defense, war, and social program spending. Today, we are at $23 trillion, about 105% of the value of our stuff. So back to the original answer. We just create more money out of thin air. And that can be totally fine. We can also create more value in our societies and economies by making more stuff to pay the debt back. But here's where I see a problem. Today's average hourly wage for workers gets you as much buying power as it did in 1978. So if you could afford what you needed back then at $4 an hour, you would need about $24 an hour today to buy the same stuff. The federal minimum wage is only $7.25 an hour. So where's all that newly created wealth from the 70s to now gone? Well, mostly to the ones at the top. Income growth for most people in the United States increased 16%. For the top 20% of Americans, it grew by 56%. And the top 1% saw an increase of 174%. So while we may have had, before this crisis, very low unemployment, you simply can't buy as much stuff with your money. What has gone up for your average worker? Debt, and lots of it. Combined household debt in 2018 came to $13.5 trillion. So yes, we're going to need to print more money to get ourselves out of this mess. The mess that printing money and irresponsible financial behavior got us into in the first place. But I hope that this time we decide to give it to the average worker and those that are most desperate in need, instead of another handout for the rich. Our current Treasury Secretary, Steve Mnuchin, was a major beneficiary of the 2008 TARP bailout, but more on that tomorrow. A crisis like the one we're facing now is awful, but it can also be an opportunity. So as Congress continues to debate the best way to use our new money, I implore them. Let's try to rebuild our society as one where most of us can feel empowered to do better, as opposed to just trying to survive.